So we've got this notion of integrating the major course materials that they've been learning all the way along, thinking about and reflecting on the graduate capabilities. So what can they do that's not strictly related to just the course content? They've also developed some other things like teamwork skills or reflection skills or their own way to evaluate certain things that might be required. This leads beautifully onto the notion of a portfolio. So when they leave the university and their employer or their prospective employer says, well, what have you learned? A capstone provides a great chance to say, look, here it is. This is one place where I've reflected on my learning. I've gathered up the evidence of the things that I've been doing. I've maybe got some feedback. I can select which things I want to show you in this context as compared with something that I might to show someone else who might have, say, been an assessor in one of my units. And they can think about how they might refine and change and adapt that pieces of evidence for their next phase of their career, whether that's to go out into a professional working context or whether it's on to further study. So this idea of a portfolio, I'm also involved I am the chair of the e-portfolio working party here at Macquarie. So that's another thing that works towards my interest in these capstone areas, because they do often have this push for students to collect evidence of what they're doing with a view to, supporting their resume when they're heading off into the next stage of their career. And of course, the idea of applying theory to practice. So rather than just keeping things at a very abstract level, the capstone provides this opportunity for people to think about what that might look like in some authentic sort of context, or how it might be used to solving a problem, for instance. So if we go on, I'll just go on to this next slide that talks about the typical focus of the types of learning outcomes. Now, this is key to when we come to looking at the types of assessment strategies we might use, as Jeff was saying before. If you have a look down that list, appreciation of complex and competing issues. So my example before that was actually Mary Byrne's example of a town planning graduate. It's a little bit of a tragedy if they come out thinking that all of the work they're going to do is going to be at a very simple level, because they will have some complex problems they'll have to solve in their graduate jobs if they go on to that work pathway. And certainly if they go to higher studies, they might end up doing a PhD program or something, which will also need them to be able to think about applying their learning to complex issues. So it's this recognition of complexity that can be tied in with the types of learning outcomes that we want to keep in mind for Capstone. An extension of the analytic and strategic thinking that they might have been doing. So trying to really extend their thinking instead of just keeping it to some of the lower order type outcomes. Applying theory to practice, as I mentioned before. And then we go into some of the almost really just graduate capabilities where it might be that you want them to start developing some types of networks. So one of the case studies we'll talk about later has this as a very strong theme coming through. And then their communication skills in an applied way. So they might need to do things like write reports in their future work if they go on a certain professional career. So if they can start developing those skills and then demonstrate them as part of the Capstone unit, that's a good way of integrating some of these different things. Say, for instance, in one of the Capstones later, in Debbie's one, she gets her students to write a report rather than an essay because she knows that will be more likely to be the type of work they need to present in their professional capacities. And there's also this teamwork focus, and then some of the notions of professionalism and things like ethics can also be brought into these Capstone learning outcomes. So you can sort of see that type of pattern emerging about the focus areas of these. Now, I'll go back and see what we've got in our chat. Sorry about this. Yes, that's a good question about should they all be treated as professional programs. We have a very large accounting well, our Faculty of Business and Economics has a strong push for professional programs there. And in lots of ways, we treat it that our capstone units can be preparing people for either professional programs or further study. And lots of the graduate capabilities, if you like, are very similar, because you still want them to be able to work in teams, you still want them to be able to think critically. So yes, you're right, there are certainly some synergies there. And then, yes, that holistic systems approach. We, almost all of my presentations end up somewhere or other with the diagram that Biggs has of the 3 Ps, just to encourage that systems approach of a curriculum where everything ties together. So yes, a way of thinking about the course design. Oh, now hang on, I went back. Often think essays are the most overused, least useful assessment tasks. Certainly when you think about some of the alternatives, and I mean these 2 capstones I happen to be talking about here are just fantastic. When you look at the really innovative assessment strategies they've used, they're really being so strategic in looking at the learning outcomes and really designing the assessment and all the teaching and learning activities to elicit those outcomes. So they don't really have to get students to write essays, because there are other things that are really so appropriate to their context. So as you say, they get a little bit overused. And old presentations about presenting information rather than persuading an audience. But that's a great comment, Janet. Really thinking about what the outcome is. Is it just to show that the students have covered all the stuff in chapter 5? Or is it about convincing people to do something? Or demonstrating a certain model that they've been looking at in the literature or whatever it is? So yes, as you say, looking at really very targeted learning outcomes that are preparing students for this completion of their undergraduate programs. So there's just one more, well, I'll just go on to a couple of these and I'll go through a little bit quickly and then we'll hand over to some comments about the design of the capstone unit. So thinking about design considerations, and there's my formatting going out the window again. Knowledge, skills and capabilities, try to avoid introducing new content. So you can already see with the previous slide, if they're the sorts of learning outcomes we want, we can't be racing through the amount of content that students typically might experience in, say, a second year program, because it doesn't leave enough headspace for them to be able to do some of the integration. And then this professional or industry link, this is a great one in terms of authenticity. And as you'll see from one of our capstone examples later, the problems, if they weren't actually situated in the workplace, they were guided by workplace problems. And so even the students that stayed on campus still had these very authentic opportunities. Another one is the notion of scaffolding. So what is it that you can do to encourage students to be able to move through the requirements, especially if they're in a dispersed environment? So if you've got your students out in a workplace context, for instance, our participation units, this scaffolding is a great opportunity for technology uses so that you can provide some of that along the way. And again, one of the examples, actually both the examples have great uses of those scaffolding techniques.